Somewhere beneath the frozen waters north of Svalbard, something is hunting. The Barents Sea is around -2 degrees Celsius, which is about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The water is cold enough to shut down a human body in minutes. And beneath that ice, more than one predator is moving. Just below the surface, a predator weighing around 5.5 metric tons, which is about 6 tons, moves through the darkness. It can suppress its breathing to avoid leaving bubbles beneath the ice. Sometimes it waits motionless near the same opening for hours. It is not alone. Farther down, where sunlight disappears completely, something else is hunting. It moves slowly through the darkness, approaching prey it cannot see. Scientists have studied its victims for decades. The evidence of its attacks is real. But no researcher has ever watched the killer make one, and beneath all of it, more than 2,300 meters, which is about 7,700 feet, below the surface, the seafloor is doing something that seems impossible. Water heated to around 371 degrees Celsius, which is about 700 degrees Fahrenheit, erupts from vents into freezing darkness. Life gathers around it, and buried in the sediment, scientists found evidence that forced them to reconsider one of the oldest questions in biology. Where did complex animal life come from? Three layers, three different hunting worlds, one frozen ocean above them. The deeper scientists went, the stranger the biology became. And what lies at the bottom connects this frozen sea to the origin of almost every complex animal alive today. Beneath the shifting surface of the Barents Sea, depth is not simply distance from the air, it is a sequence of different physical worlds, each separated by changes in temperature, light, pressure, and food. The seafloor across much of the basin lies on a broad continental shelf, with the main Barents Sea generally shallower than 500 meters, about 1,640 feet. That relative shallowness allows sunlight, currents, and seasonal ice to remain closely connected. During the brighter months, light reaches roughly 100 meters, about 330 feet, into the water. That is enough to sustain microscopic algae suspended in the sea and growing along the underside of the ice. These organisms capture sunlight and turn it into organic matter. When tiny grazers feed on them, energy begins moving upward through copepods, amphipods, fish, seals, and eventually the largest hunters. The underside of the ice therefore functions as more than a ceiling. It is a productive surface carrying its own community through the polar season. Beneath that illuminated layer, the character of the water changes gradually. Suspended particles become scarcer, colors fade, and the remaining light is absorbed until the water column becomes a place where vision offers less information with every descent. Yet material from the upper ocean continues falling downward. Dead plankton, fragments of organisms, and waste particles drift through the water as a slow rain, carrying energy into deeper habitats. Temperature adds another boundary. Cold Arctic water occupies much of the northern Barents Sea, while warmer Atlantic water enters from the southwest and moves toward the Arctic. Where these water masses meet, a broad transition called the polar front develops. It is not a solid line. It is a moving region shaped by currents, season, wind, and the changing position of the ice. Marine life responds to these gradients with remarkable precision. Fish concentrate where food is abundant, seabirds follow those concentrations, and larger predators gather where several layers of the food web overlap. The contrast becomes especially important around Svalbard. Atlantic water can carry comparatively warm conditions into areas surrounded by polar seas, while colder water remains associated with ice in the northern basin. A difference of only a few degrees can determine whether a location favors Arctic specialists or species adapted to Atlantic conditions. The boundary is therefore biological as much as physical, shifting the places where feeding, migration, and competition occur. Below the upper shelf waters, the geometry changes again. The continental shelf falls away toward deeper basins and channels, carrying cold water into environments where sunlight no longer supplies energy directly. At several thousand meters, about several thousand feet, pressure becomes enormous and temperatures approach the freezing point of seawater. Yet, even there, the water remains connected to what happens above through sinking material, circulation, and the movement of animals between depths. Three broad realms emerge from this structure. Near the surface, ice, light, and seasonal productivity shape life. In the middle water, fading light and changing pressure create a world governed increasingly by movement and sensory detection. Far below, darkness becomes permanent, and the seafloor itself begins to matter as much as the water above it. These layers are not sealed compartments. Currents carry water between them, animals cross their boundaries, and energy passes downward from the surface, while heat and chemicals rise from geological processes beneath the seabed. The result is an ocean arranged vertically as much as horizontally. A few hundred feet can separate habitats with entirely different conditions, while the same cold sea connects them into one living system. Above, ice gathers and melts with the seasons. Below, water masses slide past one another, carrying temperature and nutrients across the basin. Deeper still, the floor waits beneath pressures and darkness that belong to another kind of ocean altogether. The first sign of an orcapod is often not the whales themselves, but a change in the behavior of everything around them. Herring tighten their formation. Seabirds gather above a narrowing patch of water. Beneath the surface, dozens of bodies begin moving as though guided by a single intention. Then the pod appears, and the scattered fish become a single dense mass. Norwegian orcas have refined this into carousel feeding, a technique built around cooperation rather than individual pursuit. A pod may contain 3 to 9 whales, with different animals taking temporary roles as they guide, compress, and strike the herring. The school is gradually driven toward the surface, where escape routes become fewer. White bellies flash through the water, bubbles rise around the fish, and the whales continually adjust their positions as the formation changes. The remarkable part is not simply the coordination, it is the fact that the behavior is learned. Young whales acquire the technique by watching experienced members of their family, particularly their mothers. The movements, timing, and responses to the fish become part of a shared tradition. A calf can inherit the knowledge without inheriting it through its genes, carrying information stored instead in memory and repeated practice. Among marine mammals, this kind of cultural transmission is one of the clearest examples of behavior passing between generations. The scale of the animal makes that coordination even more striking. An adult orca can reach about 5.5 meters, about 18 feet, in length and weigh several thousand kilograms, about several tons. Its body is built for acceleration, but the hunt does not depend on speed alone. Position matters, timing matters. Each whale must recognize what the others are doing and adjust before the opportunity disappears. Herring are not the only prey that changes the rules. Near an ice edge or a breathing opening maintained by a seal, an orca has another advantage: the ability to regulate its own behavior with remarkable precision. Instead of producing the continuous stream of sounds associated with many cetacean activities, a stalking whale may reduce its vocal activity and approach with carefully controlled movements. Air is released without the conspicuous turbulence that would betray a position beneath the surface. When several whales approach an ice floe carrying a seal, cooperation takes a different form. The pod can align itself and generate a traveling wave by accelerating toward the floe before turning beneath the surface. Water rises against the edge, lifting and destabilizing the ice. The purpose is not to break the entire floe apart, but to alter the seal's position long enough for open water to become the safer route for the hunter. This behavior reveals something important about orca intelligence. Their advantage is not simply a large brain or sophisticated senses in isolation. It is the ability to combine perception, memory, communication, social learning, and physical coordination into a flexible strategy. The environment becomes part of the hunt, with ice, currents, prey behavior, and the movements of other whales incorporated into a shared plan. Even the youngest members have a role in this system. They remain close to experienced adults, observing repeated sequences until their own movements begin to fit the rhythm of the group. Over years, a hunting tradition becomes more refined, not because a single whale invents it anew, but because each generation receives a working version and modifies it through experience. Across the Barents Sea, this makes the orca more than a predator occupying the upper levels of the food web. It is a repository of learned behavior, carrying knowledge through a family line in a form that leaves no fossil record and no genetic sequence. The tradition exists only while the whales continue to teach one another, moving together through the same changing water. The bowhead carries a history in its body. Its enormous head rises through Arctic water with the same architecture that allows it to survive beneath moving ice, while its reinforced skull can break through ice roughly 20 centimeters, about 8 inches, thick from below. Adults can reach about 18 meters, about 59 feet, in length, and weigh close to 100 metric tons, about 110 tons. Yet the most remarkable measurement is not its size. It is the length of time a single animal can remain part of this ecosystem. Bowheads can live for more than 2 centuries. Evidence for this extraordinary lifespan has come from old stone harpoon fragments recovered from living whales, remnants of weapons used during earlier periods of Arctic whaling. A whale carrying one of these fragments survived an encounter that may have happened generations before the people studying it were born. In that sense, the oldest bowheads are living records of a coastline and an ocean that have changed around them. Their bodies are shaped for a world of ice. A layer of blubber approaching 50 centimeters, about 20 inches, insulates the whale against frigid water. There is no dorsal fin rising from its back, an absence that allows the animal to pass beneath ice without the obstruction such a structure would create. Its enormous skull can open a path to air when existing openings are unavailable. Even its feeding apparatus reflects the same environment. Baleen plates can reach roughly 4 meters, about 13 feet, filtering immense quantities of tiny organisms from the sea. For centuries, however, those adaptations offered little protection from a predator that could approach from open water. Commercial whaling reduced the Spitsbergen bowhead population from an estimated 50,000 animals in 1611 to only a remnant by the early 20th century. Fewer than 100 are thought to remain in the population associated with Svalbard and the Barents Sea, making each adult more than an individual within a statistical estimate. Each one represents part of a population that survived an extraordinary contraction. Orcas introduce a different kind of pressure. A bowhead is vastly larger than any single member of a pod, but size alone does not determine the encounter. Orcas can maintain pursuit, change positions, and repeatedly approach from different directions. In observations from Alaskan waters, some bowheads have carried scars consistent with earlier attacks, showing that these encounters can leave lasting marks even when the whale survives. The hunting method depends on exhaustion and access. A pod may keep a bowhead moving until the whale has fewer opportunities to rest or reach protective ice. Other whales can approach from the front or rear, while additional individuals remain near the animal's breathing space. The objective is not necessarily to overpower the whale immediately. It is to gradually remove the advantages created by its size, endurance, and access to shelter. That strategy becomes more significant as conditions around Svalbard change. Dense ice once created areas where a bowhead could remain difficult for an open water predator to reach. As seasonal ice becomes thinner and more fragmented, those boundaries become less reliable. The bowhead still carries the same skull, the same blubber, and the same ancient adaptations, but the physical setting that made those adaptations effective is shifting. For a species numbering only in the dozens, predation does not need to become common before it matters. A single death can remove a mature animal from a population already carrying the history of centuries of loss. The encounter between an orca and a bowhead is therefore more than a meeting between predator and prey. It is a meeting between two successful strategies, one built around inherited cultural knowledge and coordinated movement, the other around endurance, immense size, and a life adapted to the shelter of Arctic ice. At first glance, the Greenland shark seems almost unsuited to pursuit. Its body is heavy and cylindrical, its fins modest, and its movements lack the sudden acceleration associated with familiar marine hunters. Yet beneath the waters around Svalbard, this slow-moving animal occupies a predatory role that becomes more interesting the longer it is observed. An adult can reach about 6.5 meters, about 21 feet, in length and weigh nearly 1,000 kilograms, about 2,200 pounds. The proportions are broad and practical, built less for bursts of speed than for conserving energy. When researchers from the National Institute of Polar Research in Japan attached tracking devices to Greenland sharks in Kongsfjorden, their measurements revealed an average cruising speed of only about 1 kilometer per hour, roughly 1/2 mile per hour. Short bursts can reach around 3 kilometers per hour, approximately 2 miles per hour, still remarkably modest for an animal of this size. Even the rhythm of its tail reflects this economy. A complete sweep can take several seconds, producing a steady movement that seems almost detached from the urgency normally associated with hunting. The shark does not need to cross large distances quickly. Its advantage lies elsewhere in persistence, sensory ability, and a physiology suited to an environment where energy is precious. Its scientific name, Somniosus microcephalus, contains a reference to sleep, reflecting the languid movement that gave sleeper sharks their common name. That name becomes especially appropriate when considering another unusual feature. Many Greenland sharks carry a small parasitic copepod attached to the surface of the eye. The organism, Amatocoida elongata, feeds from tissues around the cornea and can cause substantial damage. In heavily affected individuals, vision may be severely impaired. Yet blindness does not appear to prevent successful feeding. The surrounding water offers other sources of information. Greenland sharks possess sensory systems capable of detecting chemical traces and subtle electrical signals produced by living organisms. Their hunting world, therefore, does not depend entirely on forming a visual picture of prey. A body can be detected through the traces it leaves in the water, even when the animal itself is difficult to see. There is another peculiarity hidden inside the shark, rather than on its surface. Fresh Greenland shark flesh contains high concentrations of urea and trimethylamine oxide, substances associated with the animal's ability to function under extreme pressure. In its raw state, this chemistry makes the meat unsafe to eat. Icelandic tradition developed a long fermentation and drying process that allows the flesh to be consumed after the compounds have been reduced to safer levels. The resulting food, known as hakarl, retains a strong ammonia-like odor. These traits create an unusual predator, large enough to overpower substantial prey, but moving at a pace that seems incompatible with active pursuit. Its eyes may be impaired, its muscles conserve energy, and its flesh contains chemistry that makes the animal unsuitable as ordinary food. Yet stomach studies from Arctic waters have revealed remains of seals among its prey, including ringed seals. Those remains carry an important distinction. Some recovered tissues have been sufficiently fresh that they do not resemble ordinary carrion consumed after prolonged exposure on the seafloor. The evidence suggests that Greenland sharks can obtain recently living marine mammals, despite lacking the speed and visual ability normally associated with such attacks. Physical evidence from living seals adds another layer, with spiral wounds consistent with large bites delivered from below. The pieces fit together, but the moment of capture itself remains outside, direct observation, hidden within a hunting process that science can only reconstruct from its traces. The evidence begins with what remains after feeding has already happened. In Greenland, shark stomachs, examined from waters around Svalbard, researchers have found the remains of ringed seals among fish and other marine prey. The unusual detail is their condition. Some seal material showed little evidence of the prolonged exposure expected from carrion lying on the seabed, where amphipods and other scavenging invertebrates would begin breaking down a carcass. The observations are consistent with very recent consumption, although they do not, by themselves, reveal exactly how the shark obtained the seal. Other clues come from seals that survived. Ringed seals found with spiral wounds have carried injuries consistent with a large bite involving rotation of the attacking animal. Such marks provide a rare glimpse of an encounter that happened beneath the surface and ended with the seal escaping. The wounds cannot identify every detail of the attack, but they establish that large predatory bites can occur while the seal is still alive and moving through Arctic water. One explanation proposed by researchers is especially intriguing because it begins with sleep. Ringed seals spend substantial periods resting in the water, including beneath the surface, where they can avoid exposure on the ice. Their sleep is not understood in exactly the same way as the highly divided sleep seen in some cetaceans. During underwater rest, however, a seal can remain remarkably still, reducing the movements that would otherwise advertise its position. That stillness matters because a Greenland shark does not need to depend entirely on vision. Sharks possess sensory systems capable of detecting electrical fields generated by nearby living tissue. The electrical signals produced by muscles and nerves are extremely weak, but specialized organs around the shark's head can register changes in the surrounding electric field. Chemical sensing may provide another layer of information, allowing the animal to detect traces carried through the water. A resting seal, therefore, occupies an unusual sensory state. It is breathing periodically, its heart is beating, and its muscles continue producing tiny electrical signals, yet its body may generate very little movement. A predator approaching at a slow cruising pace would create far less hydrodynamic disturbance than a fast-moving hunter. For a shark whose sensory world extends beyond sight, that combination could make a resting seal detectable without making the shark itself obvious. The physical design of the Greenland shark's jaws may also matter. Its mouth can expand during feeding, creating suction that draws water and prey inward. Suction feeding does not require the same explosive acceleration used by predators that must seize prey through a long chase. A slowly approaching shark could potentially close the final distance through a short, energy efficient movement, then use suction and jaw motion to secure the animal. Yet the distinction between a plausible mechanism and a demonstrated hunting strategy remains important. No researcher has directly watched a Greenland shark capture a sleeping ringed seal in the wild. The stomach evidence shows that seals are eaten. The wounds show that living seals can survive substantial bites. The shark possesses sensory and feeding structures that could support an underwater ambush. Together, these observations form a coherent hypothesis, but they do not constitute a recording of the event itself. That gap has persisted despite decades of Arctic research. The animal can be tagged, measured, tracked, and examined after death, while the crucial moment remains hidden. What scientists possess is a collection of traces, each revealing part of a behavior that may occur in darkness, beneath the surface, at a pace too slow to attract attention. The Greenland shark leaves evidence behind, but the act itself remains beyond direct observation. Along the shallow sea floor, the walrus moves with an unusual combination of delicacy and force. Its face is lined with hundreds of sensitive whiskers, each capable of detecting textures and movements hidden beneath sediment. An adult Atlantic walrus can reach about 3.5 meters, about 11.5 feet, in length and weigh around 1,700 kilograms, about 3,700 pounds. The body is immense, yet much of its underwater work depends on touch rather than sight. Those whiskers, called vibrissae, can contain hundreds of individual sensory bristles. As a walrus lowers its muzzle toward the seabed, the bristles sweep through the sediment and register the shape of buried animals. Clams and other benthic invertebrates become detectable beneath a layer of mud that gives the animal almost no visual information. Once a target is located, the walrus can create strong suction with its mouth, drawing the soft parts from a shell without needing to crush the shell itself. A feeding dive may reach roughly 76 meters, about 250 feet, where the animal can spend its time moving methodically across the bottom. This is a different form of hunting from the pursuit practiced by faster predators. The walrus searches an area, reads the sediment through its whiskers, and extracts one meal after another. Its daily food requirement can approach 25 kilograms, about 55 pounds, a substantial demand for an animal living on dense but scattered seafloor prey. Yet some adult males have another habit. Stomach examinations and field observations have revealed that certain large males consume animal matter that cannot be explained by ordinary shellfish feeding. Remains associated with seals, seabirds, and other marine animals have been documented in the broader Arctic range of the species. Observations from Svalbard have also recorded walruses pursuing living birds on the water and engaging with marine mammals. This predatory behavior appears to be concentrated among particular individuals rather than representing the normal feeding strategy of the entire population. Age, body size, opportunity, and learned behavior may all influence whether a male becomes an active hunter. The distinction matters because the walrus is often imagined only as a specialist in mollusks, yet its anatomy is capable of supporting a much broader range of behavior when circumstances allow it. Its tusks add another dimension. These elongated canine teeth grow in both sexes and can approach 1 meter, about 3 feet, in large males. They are used for hauling onto ice, establishing dominance, and defending against predators. During encounters with orcas, Tusks can become formidable weapons, particularly when several walruses cluster together. Polar bears also face the risk of serious injury when attempting to attack an adult walrus. The relationship between predator and prey is therefore unusually flexible around the walrus. An animal that may spend much of its life extracting clams from sediment can also pursue another animal, defend itself against one of the ocean's most coordinated hunters, and transform its tusks into weapons when threatened. Historical accounts from Svalbard preserve an even more unusual part of this relationship. In 1918, an encounter involving walruses and a boat was reported near Spitsbergen, with the vessel capsized and people aboard killed. Such accounts are rare, and the circumstances surrounding individual historical incidents can be difficult to reconstruct, but they reflect the physical force concentrated in an animal that appears slow and heavily built. Beneath the surface, the walrus occupies several roles at once. It is a grazer of the seabed, an occasional hunter, a target for orcas, and a powerful defender of its own body. Its world is shaped through contact with the sediment, the ice, and other animals, and every movement of those broad whiskers reveals a seafloor that contains far more information than the human eye could ever see. For a narwhal, depth is part of its daily routine rather than an escape reserved for emergencies. During winter, in the waters around Svalbard, these whales move beneath pack ice into regions where sunlight never reaches. A single descent can pass beyond 1,500 meters, about 4,900 feet, and last more than 25 minutes. Across a feeding day, an individual may repeat this journey many times, returning again and again to the deep water where Greenland halibut, Arctic cod, and squid gather. The body is remarkably suited to these descents. Narwhals can withstand immense changes in pressure as they travel between the surface and deep feeding grounds, and their flexible rib cages allow the chest to compress during a dive. Their blood and muscles carry substantial oxygen reserves, while the heart rate can be reduced as the animal descends. The result is an animal capable of making repeated journeys through a vertical environment that changes completely between one breath and the next. Then there is the tusk. In dominant males, the elongated left canine can approach 3 meters, about 10 feet, in length. Beneath its hard outer surface lies a structure filled with microscopic channels and sensory nerves. Research by Martin Nguyen and his colleagues has shown that the tusk is unusually sensitive, responding to changes in the surrounding water. Its exact functions remain broader than a simple weapon. It may contribute to sensing, display, social interaction, and communication, giving the narwhal an extraordinary sensory structure extending directly from its skull. At depth, vision contributes little. Instead, the narwhal builds a map through sound. It produces rapid clicks and listens for returning echoes, allowing it to detect objects and prey through darkness that would make visual searching ineffective. The returning signals carry information about distance, shape, and movement. A fish, hidden against the background of the seafloor, can become a distinct acoustic target, allowing the narwhal to feed in places where an animal dependent on sight would have almost no useful information. This ability becomes especially important when orcas enter the same region. Narwhals have been observed responding to approaching orcas by changing their movement patterns and seeking areas beneath heavier ice. In some situations, they may reduce swimming activity dramatically, a behavior associated with tonic immobility. The body sinks gradually, reducing the movement that might attract attention. Against an acoustic predator that can coordinate several individuals, disappearing into the surrounding water may offer a brief advantage. Yet the same physical environment contains another kind of uncertainty. A narwhal descending into dark water is entering a habitat also used by Greenland sharks. There is no established evidence that these sharks routinely prey upon narwhals, and no documented observation has shown a shark capturing one through a frozen response. The overlap is nevertheless real. Both animals use deep Arctic water. Both can remain within environments where vision provides little assistance, and both occupy a food web connected through the same cold water prey. For the narwhal, survival is therefore shaped by movement through layers rather than by permanent refuge. Shallow ice can restrict an orca's access while making breathing more complicated. Deeper water offers greater separation from the surface, but brings the narwhal into the range of animals adapted to darkness and pressure. Its body is built to cross these boundaries repeatedly, using stored oxygen, acoustic perception, and an extraordinary sensory tooth to navigate a habitat where the safest direction is never fixed. Each descent also carries the memory of the last one, as familiar feeding grounds become points in a changing acoustic landscape. The whale returns through darkness, guided by signals it produces itself, reading distance through echoes rather than light. The ringed seal builds its winter life around openings that are almost invisible from above. As autumn cold thickens the sea, an adult uses the claws of its foreflippers to maintain a network of breathing holes through the forming ice. These openings may be scattered across an area approaching 2 square kilometers, about 3/4 of a square mile, creating a moving map of access between air and water. A predator can watch one opening, perhaps several, but the seal's real protection is that there are many. Ice above those passages can become more than 1.5 meters, about 5 feet, thick. The seal continues to reach the surface by keeping each opening clear, scraping away new layers as they form. It may return for air every several minutes, then disappear beneath the ice and travel underwater before choosing another route upward. Its world is therefore not organized around a single doorway, but around a network that changes with weather, ice growth, and the movements of the animal itself. For mothers, the architecture becomes more elaborate. A pregnant seal excavates a chamber within a snowdrift above one of the underwater entrances. The snow forms an insulating shelter, protecting the newborn from wind and extreme cold, while concealing the chamber from predators traveling across the ice. The entrance remains beneath the surface, so the mother can move between the sea and the birth chamber without exposing the pup to an open approach from above. Newborn ringed seals carry a white coat called lanugo, closely matching the surrounding snow during their first weeks of life. This coloration is temporary, but its timing is precise. The pup arrives during a season when concealment is most valuable, while the mother maintains access to water below. A small body can remain hidden in a landscape where a few visible movements may be enough to reveal its location. Underwater endurance adds another layer. Ringed seals can remain submerged for roughly 30 minutes, allowing them to travel beneath continuous ice before surfacing somewhere beyond the immediate view of a waiting predator. The ability does not make the seal untouchable. It simply expands the number of possible routes through its habitat. Sleep creates a more subtle vulnerability. Unlike cetaceans that can maintain activity in one half of the brain while the other rests, ringed seals experience periods of deeper sleep in which both sides of the brain enter a resting state. Because resting on the ice exposes them to polar bears, they can sleep in the water instead. The choice protects them from one direction of danger while creating an opportunity for a predator approaching from below. That vulnerability is difficult to measure directly because the crucial encounters occur beneath ice and outside human observation. The Greenland shark's sensory abilities make a resting seal a plausible target, particularly when the seal's body produces little movement. Yet the seal's sleep is not simply a weakness, it is part of a larger balance between conserving energy, avoiding surface predators, and remaining close enough to an opening for the next breath. Field studies have shown how effective the seal's hidden architecture can be. Research in Hornsund during the 1980s documented polar bears entering subnivean seal lairs, yet only a small fraction of the occupied shelters examined resulted in a kill. The protection comes from layers of snow, underwater entrances, scattered breathing sites, and constant movement between them. Every part of the seal's winter existence is therefore connected to the structure of the ice. The claws, the breathing holes, the snow chamber, the white coat, the long dives, and the underwater sleep all belong to one integrated survival system. None provides complete protection. Together, they allow one of the smallest seals in the Arctic to remain present in a habitat occupied by predators many times its size. At the edge of the ice, beneath drifting fragments and the changing skin of the sea, an Arctic cod carries an entire ecosystem in a body scarcely longer than a human hand. Most reach 20 to 30 centimeters, about 8 to 12 inches, yet these small fish occupy a remarkable physiological boundary. They remain active in water below the freezing point of fresh water, sheltered by the salt in seawater and adapted to conditions that would overwhelm most marine animals. Their importance begins with what they consume. Beneath the ice, microscopic algae use seasonal light to create organic matter, and tiny crustaceans gather around that productivity. Copepods and amphipods concentrate lipids within their bodies, storing chemical energy produced at the foundation of the polar food web. Arctic cod collect that energy one small mouthful at a time, converting organisms almost invisible to the human eye into dense tissue that can be carried through the water by predators. This transfer is more than a simple link in a food chain. The cod is a kind of biological currency, moving energy from the microscopic realm into animals large enough to reshape the surrounding ecosystem. Ringed seals feed heavily upon them, particularly when other prey becomes scarce. Narwhals take Arctic cod during winter, while belugas consume them extensively in northern waters. Seabirds gather them near productive ice edges, and young fish become prey for larger Arctic cod and other hunters. From there, the energy changes form again. A seal becomes nourishment for an orca or a Greenland shark. A narwhal can sustain a predator capable of traveling vast distances through northern water. Even a walrus, whose ordinary feeding behavior centers on animals living within the seafloor, exists within the same broader network. The predators appear separate because they occupy different depths and use different strategies, yet their connection reaches downward to this small fish. Ecological models reveal the consequence of disturbing that connection. When Arctic cod biomass declines substantially, the effects propagate upward through the food web, reducing the available biomass of ringed seals, narwhals, and belugas. The response is not simply a slower version of normal seasonal change. It can become a structural shift, because fewer cod mean less energy available to support the animals that depend upon them. The vulnerability becomes clearer when the fish itself is placed beside its habitat. Arctic cod are strongly associated with cold, ice-influenced waters, and their physiology limits how far they can follow warming conditions. As the seasonal ice retreats, suitable habitat can contract towards smaller and more fragmented areas. The fish may remain abundant in some regions, while becoming increasingly concentrated within the places that still provide the combination of temperature, shelter, and food they require. The Barents Sea has supported an estimated 500,000 to 1.5 million metric tons, about 550,000 to 1,650,000 tons of Arctic cod, an immense quantity when gathered together, yet even that biomass represents something fragile. Its existence depends on a chain that begins with ice, light, and microscopic life, then passes through small crustaceans into fish, seals, whales, birds, and finally the great hunters. At the boundary, where ice gives way to open water, all of those pathways converge. Here, currents gather plankton, cod gather beneath them, seals gather where the fish concentrate, and predators arrive from different directions. The violence seen at the surface is therefore only the visible expression of a much deeper exchange. Beneath every chase is stored energy, and beneath that energy is the Arctic cod, carrying the productivity of the ice into the bodies of almost everything that hunts here. Nothing in the Barents Sea holds its position for long, but nowhere is that more apparent than at the meeting place between pack ice and open water. The ice edge can migrate hundreds of miles over the course of a year, following the seasonal rhythm of freezing and melt. What appears from above as a boundary is, beneath the surface, a moving habitat whose width and character change with wind, currents, sunlight, and temperature. Its biological importance begins with movement that cannot be seen from the surface. Water rising from deeper layers carries nutrients toward the sunlit zone, where microscopic algae begin the seasonal production that feeds the upper ocean. As spring advances, phytoplankton multiply, followed by copepods and other small grazers. Fish arrive in enormous concentrations, gathering where currents and prey create favorable feeding conditions. Capelin and herring become especially important here, transforming a pulse of microscopic productivity into bodies large enough to support seals, seabirds, whales, and the predators that follow them. The seasonal front between Arctic and Atlantic waters adds another layer to this convergence. Differences in temperature and salinity shape currents that can concentrate organisms along narrow boundaries. A herring school may gather within this productive corridor, while ringed seals move through the same water in search of food. Farther below, colder water provides a different hunting environment for Greenland sharks. The predators do not necessarily pursue one another, yet their feeding paths overlap because the same physical forces concentrate their prey. For an orca pod, this concentration creates an unusually efficient hunting ground. Herring can form dense schools, allowing coordinated groups to herd them into compact masses before feeding. Nearby, seals use the edge for access to breathing areas and resting places, placing them within reach of predators arriving from different directions. The same feature that makes food abundant also makes movement predictable, and predictability is valuable to hunters. Even the seafloor participates in this structure. Beneath the productive waters lies a broad benthic community containing 2,500 species, including sponges, cold water corals, crustaceans, starfish, worms, and other invertebrates. Their bodies and feeding activity transform sediments, recycle organic matter, and create habitats occupied by animals living close to the bottom. Walruses can exploit these communities directly, while material from the upper ocean eventually settles downward and becomes part of the deeper food web. During the brighter months, the ice edge therefore becomes a place where several biological clocks overlap. The arrival of light stimulates microscopic production. Grazing animals respond, fish gather, seals follow their prey, and larger hunters trace those concentrations. Each movement is connected to another, not through a single command, but through the physical properties of the sea itself. Then the seasonal light begins to withdraw. The ice edge remains a productive corridor, but the cues available to predators change. Visual hunting becomes less useful, while sound, pressure, scent, and other forms of sensory information become increasingly important. Echolocation can map moving prey, whiskers can register disturbances, and electrical signals may reveal living bodies nearby. The same shifting corridor that concentrates life also reshapes the sensory landscape through which that life must move. At the ice edge, geography becomes behavior. Currents gather nutrients, ice gathers organisms, organisms gather prey, and prey gathers predators. The boundary continues its seasonal journey, carrying this entire network with it, while beneath the changing surface, every hunter adjusts to a world whose most important landmarks are always moving. Even the smallest shift in that corridor can alter where energy accumulates, where prey gathers, and where predators begin their search. Across this landscape, timing becomes another form of survival. By late autumn, the Barents Sea begins to lose its connection with the sky. North of Svalbard, the sun disappears for months, and beneath the forming ice, the water enters a season governed by darkness rather than daylight. From late October into mid February, sunlight does not reach the surface in these northern waters. Without sufficient light, photosynthesis falls away, and the great summer pulse of microscopic production comes to an end. Yet the animals that depend upon that seasonal abundance do not simply vanish with it. An orca can remain in these waters, carrying its hunting life into a season when vision becomes far less useful. Its world is instead assembled through sound. Echolocation clicks travel outward, meet fish, ice, and other animals, and return with information about distance and shape. The pod can use these returning signals to locate prey and navigate through a three-dimensional landscape that the eye can no longer organize. Communication between members also remains essential, allowing coordinated movement to continue when the surface offers almost no visual reference. For the Greenland shark, the transformation is less dramatic. Its sensory world already exists far beyond the usefulness of ordinary sight. Weak electrical fields produced by living tissues can provide information at close range, while its other senses contribute to locating food and water where light is scarce. The polar night, therefore, removes a source of information that was never central to its existence. Darkness does not create a new hunting environment for this shark. It extends the conditions in which its senses are most naturally suited. The ringed seal occupies a more complicated position. Each ascent through an ice-breathing hole becomes an encounter with a surface it cannot inspect from below. Its eyes can reveal little when there is no daylight to work with, so other senses become increasingly important. Vibrations and pressure changes traveling through the water can reveal movement nearby, while sound carries information across distances. Yet a predator approaching with restrained movement may produce only a subtle disturbance. The seal must rise, breathe, and return beneath the ice without ever possessing complete knowledge of what surrounds the opening. Far below, the smallest organisms are also changing their place in the darkness. Many Arctic zooplankton species do not remain near the surface when daylight disappears. Instead, they descend through the water column, following seasonal patterns that can carry them hundreds of feet downward. Some enter states of greatly reduced activity, conserving energy until conditions improve. This vertical migration shifts the location of biological productivity, drawing the foundation of the food web into deeper water for part of the year. The ice itself also reshapes the acoustic landscape. Its underside can reflect sound, while cracks and ridges scatter returning echoes. For an animal using echolocation, these reflections reveal that darkness still has structure. Beneath the surface, the architecture of the world is carried through pressure waves and returning sound. The consequences travel upward. Fish follow concentrations of zooplankton, seals follow fish, and larger predators respond to the changing distribution of seals and other prey. Nothing about the winter ocean is truly empty. Energy has simply moved into different layers, while the animals that can track it continue their lives beneath the ice. For 4 months, the darkness becomes more than an absence of sunlight. It becomes a different sensory landscape, one where sound, pressure, electrical signals, and memory can matter more than sight. Above, the ice forms a ceiling. Below, the water carries signals from one living body to another, allowing hunters and prey to occupy the same darkness without ever sharing the same view. Water carries sound with unusual efficiency. At roughly 1,500 meters per second, about 4,900 feet per second, a pressure wave can cross distances that would take much longer through air. Temperature, salinity, and pressure alter that speed as the signal travels, bending its path through layers of different density. Beneath Arctic ice, the underside of the frozen surface can reflect portions of the sound, allowing certain frequencies to travel farther than they might in open water. The result is a three-dimensional acoustic space in which a signal may arrive from several directions, shaped by the water layers and the ice above. For an animal dependent upon returning echoes, those distortions are not meaningless noise. They are part of the landscape being interpreted. For animals living here, sound is not merely another sense. It becomes a way of constructing surroundings that cannot be seen. A narwhal sends narrow sequences of clicks into the water, each burst returning information about objects encountered along its path. Fish, drifting particles, ice formations, and the contours of the seafloor can produce different echoes. Through repeated signals, the narwhal builds an acoustic picture while moving through depths where sunlight has never reached. The tusk adds another layer to this sensory world. Its surface contains millions of microscopic pathways associated with nerves, and researchers, including Martin Nguyen, have investigated whether this unusual structure can detect changes in the surrounding water. Temperature, salinity, and pressure all leave physical signatures, and the possibility that the tusk contributes to sensing remains an active field of study. The remarkable point is not that every proposed function has been settled, but that an enormous tooth may also serve as a highly specialized interface with the environment. Orcas use sound differently, turning acoustic information into coordinated movement. Their echolocation can reveal the position of prey and help them navigate beneath ice when vision provides little assistance. Ice itself becomes part of the signal. A solid flow reflects sound differently from the surrounding water, while an animal resting upon it can create another acoustic contrast. This allows an orca to detect structure above its head and adjust its approach before appearing at the surface. Belugas live within an even broader acoustic vocabulary. Their calls include clicks, whistles, and pulsed sounds, spanning an exceptionally wide range of frequencies. Echolocation helps them navigate and locate prey, while social calls maintain contact among individuals. Yet when orcas approach, belugas have been documented, reducing their vocal activity dramatically. The change may reduce the acoustic information available to a predator, but it also leaves the belugas with less active sonar information of their own. In darkness, withdrawing a signal can therefore become both concealment and sensory deprivation. Scientists can listen to this entire environment without entering it directly, hydrophones lowered beneath the Barents Sea ice record overlapping layers of sound, from biological signals to cracking ice and shifting water. Each recording becomes a trace of movement that human eyes could never follow in real time. A series of clicks can mark a hunting animal passing through darkness. A sudden change in vocal activity can reveal that another species has entered the area. Even the ice contributes its own changing acoustic texture. What emerges is a living landscape written in pressure waves. Predators search through echoes, prey respond to unfamiliar signatures, and social groups maintain contact across distances hidden from sight. Beneath the ice, sound does not simply accompany the ecosystem. It helps create the information by which the ecosystem operates, carrying the presence of one animal toward another long before their bodies meet. Beneath the ice, a beluga can turn its entire body into a pale shape against the world above. Adult belugas are among the few whales whose coloration changes so completely with age, becoming almost entirely white as they mature. In the waters around Svalbard, this appearance can blur their outline when seen against broken ice from below, a useful form of concealment in a habitat where predators may approach from several directions. Their greater defense, however, is carried through sound. Belugas produce an extraordinary variety of clicks, whistles, chirps, squeals, and tonal calls, creating one of the richest vocal repertoires known among cetaceans. Mariners once compared their voices to music carried through the water, while older whalers gave them the familiar nickname of canaries of the sea. Modern recordings reveal something more intricate, with individuals altering calls according to social circumstances, maintaining contact, and using echolocation to shape an acoustic map of their surroundings. Clicks can return from fish, ice, and the seafloor with different acoustic signatures, allowing the animal to distinguish useful structure from empty water. In a habitat where visibility may disappear for months, this information remains available even when the surrounding world has no visible landmarks. That map becomes especially important when another sound enters it. Orcas can be detected before they come into view, and beluga groups have been observed changing direction after recognizing their acoustic presence. The response can involve tighter group formation and movement toward shallow water beneath ice, where the physical structure of the habitat limits an orca's ability to maneuver. The chase, therefore, begins at the level of sound, long before one animal can distinguish the other with its eyes. Distance becomes information before either body becomes visible through frozen water around them. Sometimes the refuge becomes dangerously shallow. Belugas need access to air, yet during intense pursuit they may enter water where breathing opportunities become difficult. In such moments, the geometry of the ice becomes part of the survival strategy. A narrow channel can obstruct a predator while simultaneously restricting the path to the surface. The same structure that offers protection can also reduce the room available for breathing. Food draws the beluga through this same landscape. In Svalbard, Arctic cod forms an important part of its diet, connecting the whale to the small fish that gather around the ice and to the microscopic organisms that sustain them. When changing conditions alter the distribution of Arctic cod, the belugas must adjust their movements as well. Their feeding grounds and some of their safest refuges can therefore shift in related directions, tying nourishment and protection to the same changing habitat. There is another layer to this movement beneath the surface. Greenland shark stomach studies from the region have recovered beluga remains, showing that the white whale is not beyond the reach of the slow predator below. A beluga, moving into deeper water to escape an orca, can enter a different hunting environment, where darkness and depth favor an animal that does not depend upon ordinary vision. The boundaries between refuge and danger are therefore remarkably fluid. Above this submerged network, another presence moves through the Arctic water, much larger than the beluga and shaped by a very different way of life. Its body is built for open water, its movements are visible from a distance, and its feeding behavior has drawn the attention of the same predators that have been following the belugas. The white whales continue their passage beneath the ice, guided by sound, food, and the narrow geography of survival, while something much larger approaches through the same cold water. There are whales in the Arctic whose lives can stretch across generations of human memory. The bowhead is one of them, and the small Spitsbergen stock carries a history written not only in genetic inheritance, but in the scars left by an older ocean economy. When European whalers reached these northern waters in 1611, bowheads were still abundant enough to support sustained hunting. The first commercial voyages transformed the animal from a distant Arctic presence into a highly valued source of oil, baleen, and other materials, beginning a long period of relentless pursuit. Over the centuries, commercial whaling reduced the population to a fraction of its former size. Today, fewer than 100 are believed to remain around Svalbard, making every encounter with one an encounter with an animal from a population that never fully recovered. The individual bowhead has an unusual relationship with time. Its longevity gives the species a living connection to changes that would otherwise belong only to historical records. Some can live for more than 200 years, making them the longest-lived mammals known to science. In Alaskan waters, researchers have found fragments of 19th-century harpoons embedded in living whales, weapons carried beneath healed tissue for generations. A surviving bowhead can therefore contain physical evidence from an era when the animal's species was being pursued across the same Arctic passages that its descendants still travel. Its body is shaped around the demands of an existence beneath ice, a layer of blubber approaching 50 centimeters, about 20 inches, thick provides insulation against water that remains near its freezing point. The absence of a dorsal fin allows the whale to pass beneath flows without the projecting structure that would interfere with movement or become vulnerable against ice. Its enormous skull is reinforced with dense bone, allowing a bowhead to push through ice when access to the surface is blocked. In a habitat where breathing holes may not always be available, the whale can make its own. Feeding requires an entirely different kind of strength. Bowheads carry the longest baleen of any whale, with individual plates reaching roughly 4 to 5 meters, about 13 to 16 feet, in length. Rather than pursuing large animals, the whale moves through concentrations of copepods and other small organisms, filtering enormous volumes of seawater through the fringed plates. The contrast is remarkable in scale. One of the largest animals in the Arctic survives by gathering creatures that are nearly invisible to the eye, converting countless tiny bodies into the energy required to sustain a massive warm-blooded life. For centuries, the greatest danger to this animal came from the surface. Now another predator is gaining access to waters that once offered the bowhead greater protection. As sea ice retreats, orcas can travel farther north into regions historically dominated by heavier ice. In other Arctic populations, coordinated orca attacks on bowheads have involved several animals surrounding a whale, exhausting it through repeated pursuit and targeting vulnerable areas around the head and breathing openings. The same species and hunting traditions are now encountering the diminished Spitsbergen stock with increasing opportunity. For a population numbering only in the tens, the appearance of a new predator is not simply another entry in an Arctic food web. It changes the balance around an animal that has already survived centuries of human pressure, long migrations, and a climate shaped by ice. The bowhead moves through this ocean carrying an unusually long memory in its body, while beneath it the food web continues to rearrange itself. The deepest waters remain largely unexplored, and below the familiar hunting grounds lies a realm where the boundaries of this Arctic system become less certain. The seafloor west of Svalbard falls away into a landscape that has almost nothing in common with the water above. The Fram Strait is the only deep connection between the Arctic Ocean and the Atlantic, and along its central passage, the seabed reaches roughly 4,500 meters, about 14,800 feet, below the surface. At that depth, pressure rises enormously. Temperatures remain close to the freezing point of seawater, and sunlight has been absent for many thousands of years. In May of 2024, an international expedition aboard the Norwegian icebreaker Kronprins Haakon entered this hidden terrain with a remotely operated vehicle called Aegir 6000. 35 scientists from 15 academic institutions examined sections of the Knipovich Ridge, a spreading system where the seafloor is slowly pulled apart and new crust forms. Some of the terrain had never before been reached by an instrument capable of observing it directly. What the cameras encountered was not an empty plain. Bamboo corals rose from the sediment, accompanied by gardens of sponges and other animals adapted to life without sunlight. Among them was a stalked crinoid, sometimes called a sea lily, a lineage whose fossil history reaches back more than 450 million years. One observation showed the crinoid interacting with an octocoral in a manner with no previous record from any ocean. The importance of such a moment lies in its simplicity. A species does not need to be unknown to science for its behavior to remain undiscovered. At about 2,800 meters, about 9,200 feet, on the Knipovich Ridge, the expedition recorded a vivid red sea star. Red wavelengths disappear rapidly beneath seawater, so at sufficient depth, a red animal can appear almost black to a visual predator. The color, therefore, has little obvious value as camouflage in darkness. Its persistence may instead reflect the energetic economy of pigment production, a reminder that evolution can preserve traits for reasons that are not immediately visible from the world around them. Other organisms supplied their own illumination. Blue and green bioluminescent flashes emerged from animals living where sunlight never reaches, turning chemistry into the only natural light available in their surroundings. These brief emissions can serve many purposes, including attracting prey, confusing predators, signaling to members of the same species, or simply arising from chemical reactions whose function remains uncertain. The expedition also located the Jodel vent field on the ridge, an active hydrothermal system whose biological community had not yet been documented at the time of the survey. Hydrothermal vents release heated, chemically altered water from beneath the crust, creating oases where microbial communities can build food webs without relying directly on sunlight. Until samples and observations reveal what lives there, the vent remains a biological blank space. That uncertainty is part of what makes the deep Fram Strait so important. Decades of Arctic research have not erased the unknown beneath the surface. Instead, every descent has shown how much more complicated the seafloor becomes when the instruments finally reach it. Coral gardens, ancient animal lineages, unfamiliar interactions, strange pigments, living lights, and an unexplored vent field all occupy the same broad passage that connects two oceans, far below the predators that patrol the upper waters. Another ecosystem is unfolding according to chemistry, pressure, and heat. The Arctic food web does not end where sunlight disappears. It changes its source of energy, its architecture, and its rules, continuing into a realm where even the first glimpse of an animal can become a discovery. At the bottom of the Arctic mid-ocean ridge, the seafloor opens into a place shaped by heat rather than sunlight. Loki's castle lies in Norwegian waters at a depth of about 2,300 meters, roughly 7,500 feet, where the surrounding seawater remains near freezing. The vent field was discovered in July of 2008 by a multinational expedition from the University of Bergen, becoming the most northerly active black smoker field then known to science. 5 mineral chimneys rise from the seabed, releasing superheated water that can reach about 371 degrees Celsius, roughly 700 degrees Fahrenheit, before mixing rapidly with the ocean around it. The transition occurs across distances, small enough to span with a hand. Within one place, conditions shift from temperatures capable of damaging living tissue almost instantly to water cold enough to threaten an unprotected body. Yet life gathers directly across this boundary. White bacterial mats spread over the chimneys, nourished by compounds carried upward from beneath the crust. These organisms do not depend on sunlight. Instead, they use chemosynthesis, a process that turns chemical energy from substances such as hydrogen sulfide into energy that supports living cells. In this setting, the foundation of the food web begins with chemistry emerging from the earth rather than light arriving from the sky. Around the bacterial growth live tube worms, specialized gastropods, amphipods, isopods, and sea spiders, each adapted to conditions that would exclude most familiar marine animals. Their communities are unusually isolated. Surveys of Loki's castle have revealed species found nowhere else, with endemism reaching remarkably high levels. 5 species had been formally described from the field by 2024, while additional organisms were still awaiting formal scientific description. The isolation has an evolutionary consequence. When a population remains separated from neighboring habitats, generations can accumulate differences that eventually produce entirely distinct species. At Loki's castle, that process unfolds around a geological engine that is still active. The Arctic mid-ocean ridge spreads by about 2 centimeters, approximately 1 inch, each year, gradually creating new seafloor as tectonic plates move apart. The vent field, therefore, belongs to a landscape that is being constructed while its inhabitants colonize and adapt to it. New rock forms gradually, fractures open, fluids circulate through hidden passages, and each change reshapes the chemistry available to the organisms above within this narrow, living frontier of change. Its name came from the unusual shapes of the chimneys, which reminded the expedition team of a fantastical castle. The reference to Loki, the Norse god associated with trickery, also reflected how difficult the field had been to locate. Beneath that playful name was a more profound surprise. The sediment around these vents contained genetic and microbial evidence that would alter ideas about the deepest branches of life. Hydrothermal vents had already shown that ecosystems could flourish without sunlight, but Loki's castle offered something more fundamental. Microbes living in this chemically rich environment carried genes and cellular machinery associated with ancient forms of metabolism. Their existence helped strengthen the possibility that some of life's earliest pathways may have developed in environments resembling hydrothermal systems, where water, minerals, heat, and chemical gradients meet. Down there, the Earth is not merely supporting life, it is supplying the chemistry from which life can build itself, while the crust continuously changes beneath the community. Loki's castle is therefore both habitat and experiment, a place where geology and biology remain inseparable, and where the oldest chapters of living history may still be preserved in the chemistry rising from the seafloor. The sediment beneath Loki's castle contains a history older than any predator moving through the waters above it. In 2015, researchers studying material recovered from the vent field identified an unfamiliar group of archaea, single-celled organisms without a cell nucleus, and named them Lokiarchaeota after the place where they were found. The discovery gave scientists a new way to examine one of biology's deepest transitions, the emergence of complex cells. For much of modern biology, life had been arranged into three broad domains. Bacteria formed one branch, archaea another, and eukaryotes a third. Bacteria and archaea are both built from relatively simple cells without nuclei, although their chemistry and cellular machinery differ profoundly. Eukaryotes are more elaborate. Their cells contain internal compartments, including the nucleus, and they make possible every animal, plant, fungus, and other complex organism familiar today. Lokiarchaeota did not fit comfortably into the old picture. Their genomes contain genes associated with features once thought to be especially characteristic of eukaryotic cells. Some were linked to reshaping cell membranes, transporting material within cells, and organizing internal structures. These genes suggested that the machinery required for cellular complexity had deeper roots among archaea than scientists had previously recognized. The finding did not mean that Lokiarchaeota itself was the direct ancestor of every animal. Evolution does not leave a single modern species behind as a perfect living ancestor. Instead, the organisms represented a branch close to the lineage from which eukaryotes emerged. Their genomes preserved clues to a biological stage in which simpler cells already possessed some of the molecular tools that could later support greater internal complexity. That distinction matters because the transition from a simple cell to a complex one was one of the most consequential events in Earth's history. Once internal membranes and specialized compartments became possible, cells could distribute different chemical tasks into different regions. Larger genomes could be maintained and expressed through increasingly intricate systems. Over immense spans of time, those capabilities opened pathways toward multicellular organisms, nervous systems, muscles, sensory organs, and eventually the predators occupying the Arctic waters above. The discovery became especially significant when related archaeal groups were found in other seafloor sediments. Thoraarchaeota, Odonarchaeota, and Heimdallarchaeota expanded the picture, revealing a broader family of organisms carrying molecular features connected with the ancestry of complex cells. Together, these discoveries strengthened the view that eukaryotes arose from within the archaeal domain rather than developing as an entirely separate lineage. Published in Nature in 2015, the Lokiarchaeota finding, therefore, reached far beyond the cold sediment where the organisms were discovered. The same deep biological history runs through the cells of an orca, a narwhal, a ringed seal, a Greenland shark, and every human being listening now. Their bodies appear impossibly different, shaped by millions of years of separate evolution, yet every one of them inherits cellular machinery from an ancient lineage that began its transformation long before animals existed. Far below the hunting grounds of the Arctic, the sediment preserves a trace of that transition. The vent community is powered by chemistry rising from Earth's interior, while the ecosystems above ultimately depend on energy entering through the surface. One world draws its energy from minerals and chemical gradients. The other begins with photons captured by microscopic life near the ocean's surface. Between them lies an enormous physical distance, but beneath that separation, the same ancient cellular inheritance persists. Their recent food webs are separate, and their environments seem almost unrelated. Yet at the level of cellular ancestry, the distance collapses. The oldest story shared by every complex creature in this ocean is not written in bone, tooth, or baleen. It is written inside the living cell. Above the seabed, the Arctic food web begins with sunlight. Microscopic organisms capture energy near the surface. Zooplankton consume that production, and Arctic cod carry the stored energy into larger bodies. From there it passes through ringed seals, narwhals, belugas, and other animals, eventually reaching orcas, Greenland sharks, walruses, and other hunters. The entire visible system is connected by energy that entered the ocean from above. Far below that familiar chain, another system follows a completely different rule. At Loki's castle, life does not depend on sunlight reaching the sea. Microorganisms obtain energy from chemicals emerging through the seafloor, building biomass from reactions driven by the planet's internal heat. No phytoplankton bloom is required. No Arctic cod carries energy downward. The vent community has its own foundation, assembled directly from geology. The separation is remarkable because the two systems occupy the same column of seawater. A Greenland shark can descend to more than 2,000 meters, about 6,600 feet, placing it within the broad depth range where hydrothermal environments occur. Yet no documented observation has shown Greenland sharks feeding within the Loki's castle vent community. The physical overlap does not appear to produce a biological connection. One world passes above the other without sharing its food web. That distinction becomes more intriguing across the wider ridge system. The Jotun vent field on the Knipovich Ridge has been located, but its biological community remains largely unexplored. Farther east, the Aurora vent field on the Gokul Ridge lies at depths approaching 4,000 meters, about 13,000 feet, where the pressure, chemistry, and temperature create another environment with its own possibilities for life. Preliminary observations suggest that its communities may differ from those known at Loki's castle. Each discovery adds another layer to an ocean that is often described as though it were a single, continuous habitat. In reality, depth, temperature, pressure, chemistry, currents, sediment, and geology divide the sea into countless environments. Some are linked by feeding relationships. Others share only the water surrounding them. Still others may be separated by distances that seem modest on a map but become ecological boundaries once the conditions on either side diverge. This makes the deep Arctic especially revealing. The same water column can contain a surface ecosystem whose energy begins with sunlight and a seafloor ecosystem whose energy begins with chemical reactions beneath the crust. Between them are layers of water inhabited by organisms following their own physical and biological limits. A predator may cross several of these layers during a dive without ever becoming part of the communities below. The possibility of undiscovered systems extends far beyond the known vent fields. Much of the deep Arctic seafloor remains difficult to reach, and biological surveys cover only a fraction of its terrain. Unseen ridges, sediment basins, fractures, and mineral deposits may host organisms adapted to conditions unlike anything yet sampled. Some communities could resemble known vent ecosystems. Others may represent lineages and chemical strategies that science has not encountered. The ocean, then, is better imagined not as one ecosystem but as a vast arrangement of overlapping worlds. They share currents and molecules, yet their sources of energy, inhabitants, and evolutionary histories can remain remarkably separate. Above, sunlight feeds a chain of hunters and prey. Below, Earth's internal heat sustains life without any contribution from the surface. Both exist within the same Arctic water, while the boundary between them remains largely unexplored. Even the boundary between these realms is not a simple wall. Water carries dissolved minerals upward and organic particles downward, allowing limited exchange without creating a shared food chain. Physical contact can exist where ecological dependence does not. The retreat of Arctic sea ice is not only a change visible from above, beneath the surface, it alters the architecture of an entire living system. Since satellite observations began in 1979, Arctic sea ice extent has declined by approximately 13% per decade, with the Barents Sea among the regions experiencing especially rapid loss. Each season of reduced ice changes where organisms can feed, shelter, reproduce, and encounter one another. Along the underside of sea ice, algae grow on surfaces that seem almost barren from a distance. Amphipods graze among this growth, and juvenile Arctic cod use the intricate spaces around the ice as shelter. When the ice disappears, that physical habitat disappears with it. The loss is therefore more than a reduction in area. A three-dimensional structure supporting microscopic production and small animals becomes open water, and the earliest stages of the food web are rearranged. Arctic cod are particularly tied to this changing boundary. Their distribution follows cold, ice-associated water, so retreating ice pushes their habitat toward higher latitudes. That movement affects animals feeding directly upon them. Ringed seals must adjust their foraging range. Narwhals and belugas follow their principal prey while also seeking conditions that provide refuge from predators. Orcas can enter waters that were once more heavily protected by ice, while Greenland sharks encounter a changing arrangement of prey and temperature layers. The movement of water itself adds another dimension. Atlantic water entering the Barents Sea carries greater heat and different biological communities than the colder Arctic water it meets. As warming progresses, the boundary between these water masses shifts northward. Scientists use the term Atlantification for this continuing transformation, because Atlantic characteristics are becoming increasingly prominent across regions that were once more strongly governed by Arctic conditions. For predators, the consequences are not distributed evenly. Species adapted to open water can gain access to places that were previously difficult to reach, while animals dependent on stable ice conditions lose portions of their habitat. The same retreat can therefore remove refuge from one species while creating hunting opportunities for another. A seal emerging near an ice edge may still find shelter beneath frozen cover, but the distance between that refuge and open water predators can change as the boundary moves. The seasonal corridor where many species gather is also being displaced. Productive waters, once associated with a broader ice edge, can become concentrated closer to the remaining frozen boundary. As that boundary contracts, feeding opportunities become increasingly concentrated into narrower regions. Predators with different hunting methods may then encounter one another more often, not because their behavior has suddenly changed, but because the geography separating them is being reduced. The transformation reaches beyond individual species. Changes in ice cover alter light beneath the surface, freshwater distribution, ocean circulation, nutrient movement, and the timing of biological production. These shifts can influence when plankton become abundant, when fish gather, and when larger animals arrive. A change at the surface can therefore propagate downward through many layers of the ecosystem without needing to touch every species directly. What is unfolding in the Barents Sea is a redistribution of living space. The ice is retreating, Atlantic influence is advancing, and organisms adapted to different conditions are meeting within a geography that no longer resembles the one their ancestors occupied. The predators remain, the prey remain, and the water remains connected, but the distances between them are changing. In an ecosystem built around the position of ice, moving the ice means moving the entire map. Over time, even small shifts in that map can accumulate, altering migration routes, feeding seasons, and the places where young animals first encounter the wider ocean. The result is not a single collapse arriving at one moment, but a continuing rearrangement of relationships that once formed around a stable, seasonal boundary. A different kind of movement is unfolding beneath the changing surface, one measured not by retreating ice, but by arrivals. Atlantic cod, a powerful generalist among northern fish, has expanded northward through the Barents Sea and now occupies areas once dominated more strongly by Arctic cod. This matters because the two species do not simply share the same water. Atlantic cod can consume capelin, young fish, invertebrates, and Arctic cod itself, placing it across several levels of the food web at once. Its presence changes the balance around every feeding ground it enters. Arctic cod is closely tied to cold water and ice-associated habitat, while Atlantic cod can use a broader range of conditions. As warmer Atlantic water extends farther north, the advantage shifts towards species capable of exploiting that wider environment. The result is not necessarily a sudden replacement, but a gradual reshaping of which fish are abundant, where they gather, and which predators can depend on them. Herring are moving through the same changing geography. In recent years, large concentrations have appeared in Norwegian fjords near Svalbard during winter, creating dense seasonal food sources that can draw orcas toward places where their presence was once less common. A school of herring can transform the movement of an entire pod because thousands of fish concentrated into a narrow space offer an opportunity that rewards coordinated hunting. Yet the orcas are no longer alone at these gatherings. Humpback whales and fin whales, once less regular visitors to waters around Svalbard, are increasingly documented feeding on the same concentrations of capelin and herring. Their arrival adds immense bodies to an already crowded food landscape. For seals and smaller whales, the issue is not simply how much prey exists, but how many mouths are now drawing from the same supply. One of the clearest examples comes when humpback whales pass through an orca feeding formation around a herring school. The orcas may spend several minutes compressing fish into a dense bait ball, coordinating their positions and timing. A humpback can then move through the concentration with its enormous mouth open, engulfing large quantities of prey in a single passage. The carefully coordinated formation disperses, and the orcas shift elsewhere. No conflict is required. Size alone changes the economics of the feeding event. Ecologists can describe this transformation mathematically through the structure of a food web. A study published in Nature Communications in 2015 examined how Atlantic species entering Arctic communities increase connectance, meaning that more predator and prey relationships become linked. At the same time, modularity can decline. In a strongly modular ecosystem, disturbances may remain concentrated within particular groups. When connections multiply across the network, a change affecting one species can travel through many others. Greater species richness can therefore coexist with greater ecological vulnerability. More kinds of animals may inhabit the Barents Sea, while the relationships between them become increasingly interdependent. A decline in one prey species can reach more predators, while the arrival of a new competitor can alter several feeding pathways at once. The system becomes more crowded, more connected, and potentially less able to absorb a disruption without passing its effects onward. For the orca, this changing arrangement may offer unusual advantages. It is not bound to one prey, one depth, or one fixed hunting ground. Its range can follow the distribution of profitable food, allowing it to exploit new concentrations as northern waters change. The same flexibility that once helped it track seasonal prey now places it among the species capable of following a shifting Arctic. The south is moving north, and the predator that follows opportunity may move with it. The advantage begins with geography. An orca does not need the Arctic to remain frozen in order to survive there. Its body is built for open water, and its hunting culture allows different pods to specialize in different prey, techniques, and seasons. Where ice once formed a physical boundary, thinning cover creates passages, openings, and longer periods of access. The animal can simply enter. For bowhead whales, that change reaches deeper than a shift in feeding grounds. Dense pack ice once provided a refuge that was difficult for orcas to penetrate. A bowhead could remain among heavy flows where the geometry of the ice limited pursuit from below and restricted the space available for coordinated attacks. As that cover becomes more fragmented, the protected areas become smaller and more temporary. The whale still possesses the same massive body, thick blubber, and ability to break through ice, but one of its oldest defenses depends on the ice remaining difficult to cross. Herring provide another route north. Norwegian orca populations were estimated at roughly 3,000 animals in the early 1990s, following seasonal concentrations of herring through Norwegian and Barents Sea waters. When the fish shift with changing temperature and currents, the predators move with them. Their range is therefore not fixed by a map. It is drawn by prey. That flexibility comes from more than physical endurance. Orcas transmit hunting behavior socially, allowing young animals to acquire techniques through years of observation and participation. Carousel feeding can concentrate schooling fish into dense formations. Wave washing can dislodge seals from ice. Coordinated attacks can divide the movement of a large whale among several hunters. These are not isolated reflexes. They are learned traditions carried within families and pods, capable of being modified when familiar conditions change. Such adaptability becomes especially important when prey animals encounter predators in places where their inherited escape strategies were shaped under different circumstances. Narwhals and belugas can retreat toward shallow, ice-covered water, but those refuges become less reliable as open passages widen. The Spitsbergen bowhead population faces an even narrower margin, with so few animals remaining that repeated losses can carry consequences for the entire stock. The arrival of more frequent orca encounters does not create a new predator. It removes the distance that once separated predator and prey. For the orca, the transformation can look almost effortless. A fish school shifts, and the pod follows. A channel opens, and the pod enters. A familiar hunting method encounters unfamiliar prey, and generations of social learning provide a foundation for adaptation. The animal does not need one particular landscape to remain unchanged. It needs enough food, enough space, and a community capable of passing knowledge forward. That same flexibility has no equivalent for every species sharing these waters. A narwhal cannot simply become an open ocean generalist within a few generations. A bowhead cannot replace centuries of refuge with a learned technique. Their bodies, diets, migrations, and reproductive strategies are tied to conditions that are changing around them. Far below, The Greenland shark faces a different problem. Its advantage comes from extreme tolerance of cold rather than behavioral flexibility alone. As warmer Atlantic water advances into the Arctic, the environmental conditions that suit this ancient predator can become less widespread. The orca gains access when barriers disappear. The shark may lose habitat when the cold itself retreats. One predator benefits from a world becoming more connected, while another depends on the persistence of a physical condition that is becoming less secure. Their paths can overlap in the same water, yet the meaning of environmental change is moving in opposite directions for each of them. A Greenland shark can carry the passage of centuries within a body that changes almost imperceptibly. Some individuals are estimated to reach more than 500 years, making this species the longest lived vertebrate known to science. During one lifetime, an individual could witness the rise and disappearance of entire human industries, the retreat of glaciers, changes in sea ice, and the rearrangement of Arctic food webs. Time, for this animal, is not measured in seasons alone. Its biology moves on an equally extended scale. Female Greenland sharks may not reach sexual maturity until roughly 150 years of age, and their reproduction is thought to involve long intervals between generations. An animal born during the present century could still be decades from maturity when the coastline, currents, and distribution of its prey have changed substantially. Evolution normally works through successive generations, but the generations of this shark unfold at a pace that is almost geological. Cold is another part of that ancient rhythm. Greenland sharks are strongly associated with frigid northern waters, often inhabiting temperatures close to the freezing point of seawater. Tagged individuals have traveled from near the surface to depths exceeding 2,000 meters, about 6,600 feet, moving through a vast vertical range while remaining within conditions suitable for their physiology. In the Barents Sea, however, warmer Atlantic water is advancing northward, changing the location and thickness of the coldest available layers. The shark can respond by moving. That ability matters, but movement is not the same as adaptation. A population may shift toward deeper or more northerly water while its preferred habitat becomes increasingly compressed. The colder refuge does not necessarily vanish all at once. It can become fragmented, concentrated near the polar boundary, or confined to deeper parts of the ocean. For an animal capable of traveling great distances, the problem may therefore become one of access rather than endurance. Across its immense lifespan, the Greenland shark has already lived through major environmental transitions. It has persisted through the Little Ice Age, through centuries of commercial exploitation of Arctic wildlife, and through dramatic changes in the abundance and distribution of marine animals. Those transformations unfolded across timescales that allowed populations to persist through gradual adjustment. The present warming of the Barents Sea is different in one important respect. The physical conditions are shifting within decades. While a single generation of Greenland sharks can span well beyond a century, an individual alive today could have been born centuries ago, when the Arctic coastline was shaped by different patterns of ice, when bowhead whales were far more numerous, and when walruses occupied a broader range of northern habitats. Its sensory world has remained functional throughout all those changes, yet the ecological map around it has been rewritten. There is no known behavior that can make cold water remain cold, and no learned hunting technique can restore a vanished temperature regime. That is the strange balance within such an ancient animal. Longevity has allowed the Greenland shark to persist through changes that would erase shorter-lived species from the historical record. Yet the same longevity slows the arrival of each new generation, limiting how rapidly natural selection can reshape the population. An animal built to endure centuries may be exceptionally well suited to a stable world that changes slowly, while becoming increasingly vulnerable when the environment moves faster than its life cycle. Far above those depths, another ancient Arctic presence is returning to places shaped by its disappearance. The walrus is not waiting for the old world to return unchanged. It is entering a new one, carrying with it a history that reaches back long before the modern Arctic was transformed. A coastline that once held only scattered traces of the walrus is beginning to carry its weight again. Atlantic walruses were once abundant around Svalbard, with historical estimates reaching into the tens of thousands before European hunting intensified during the 17th century. Their tusks supplied ivory, their hides supplied leather, and their thick bodies provided blubber. Over centuries, relentless exploitation reduced the population until only a remnant remained by the early 20th century. Protection changed the direction of that history. Under Norwegian law, hunting was restricted and the surviving animals gained space to reproduce. Gradually, familiar haul-out grounds began to fill again. Groups gathered on beaches and low rocky shores, sometimes crowding together in numbers that would have been difficult to imagine during the years of intense exploitation. The return is measurable, but its importance reaches beyond the animals themselves. A walrus changes the seafloor simply by feeding. It can descend to roughly 76 meters, about 250 feet, and search through soft sediment with sensitive whiskers capable of detecting buried prey. Clams, worms, crustaceans, and other bottom-dwelling animals become accessible as the walrus disturbs the upper layers of the seabed. Its snout and forelimbs move sediment aside, exposing organisms that would otherwise remain hidden beneath the surface. That disturbance has a name, bioturbation, and it is one of the less visible ways an animal can reshape an ecosystem. Sediment is not merely moved from one place to another. Buried organic material is brought closer to oxygenated water. Nutrients can be released, and small organisms living within the seabed are redistributed. Currents then carry some of those materials beyond the feeding ground, allowing the effects of repeated foraging to spread through surrounding habitat. As walruses return to more of their former range, these movements accumulate. A larger population means more dives, more disturbed sediment, and more opportunities for nutrients locked into the seabed to re-enter the surrounding system. The recovery, therefore, has a physical dimension that extends beneath the animals themselves. Their presence becomes part of the chemistry and structure of the places where they feed. Yet the water surrounding this recovery is no longer the same environment their ancestors inhabited. Sea ice is less extensive, Atlantic water reaches farther north, and fish communities are being reorganized. The walruses are returning, while the ecological conditions around them continue to change. A successful recovery in numbers does not mean a return to the former ecosystem. It means a growing population entering a transformed one. That transformation also changes the relationship between predator and prey. Orcas are among the very few natural predators capable of attacking walruses, and their increasing presence around Svalbard brings two populations together after more than a century of separation. Young walruses, born during the recovery, may encounter orcas under conditions their recent ancestors rarely experienced. Orcas, in turn, have little recent opportunity to acquire specialized knowledge about hunting this prey in these waters. Social hunters depend heavily on learned behavior, so the first encounters may carry significance beyond a single feeding event. Whether attacks become common, remain occasional, or are avoided altogether depends on factors still being observed. The walrus is returning through a doorway opened by conservation, but the landscape beyond it has been rearranged. Its recovery remains one of the clearest signs that protection can restore a large Arctic animal when enough time and habitat remain. Yet restoration does not rewind an ecosystem. The walrus returns with its ancient habits to a sea carrying unfamiliar currents, altered prey distributions, reduced ice, and newly arriving predators. The animal has come back, but the world receiving it has continued to change. The newest predator in these waters does not have fins, flukes, tusks, or gills. It arrives through decisions made far beyond the reach of sunlight, carrying engines, instruments, hulls, cables, and the ability to transform places without needing to live there. For much of the Arctic, research vessels have been the gentlest expression of that presence. Remotely operated vehicles have reached seafloor landscapes that no human could visit directly, recording animals, collecting sediment, and revealing communities that had remained outside scientific knowledge. Each expedition expands the map, yet the same retreating ice that makes exploration easier is also making the region more accessible to commercial traffic. Ships introduce sound into a world where sound carries extraordinarily well. Orcas coordinate movements through calls and echoes. Narwhals and belugas use acoustic signals to navigate, communicate, and locate objects around them. Engine noise and other underwater sounds can overlap with portions of these acoustic environments, potentially reducing the distance across which animals can detect one another or interpret their surroundings. For species living through sound, a louder ocean can become a less legible one. The change is not confined to the surface. As northern routes become more accessible, industrial interest reaches downward toward the geological structures beneath the seabed. Hydrothermal systems can concentrate metals such as copper, zinc, and gold, along with other elements valuable to modern technology. These deposits form where heated fluids circulate through fractured rock and return minerals to the ocean floor, creating chemical landscapes that may persist for long periods. Loki's castle makes the biological stakes unusually clear. Its vent communities contain organisms found nowhere else, including species that science has only recently encountered, and others still awaiting formal description. Some occupy highly specialized habitats shaped by chemistry, temperature, and the mineral surfaces around the vents. Their isolation has allowed evolutionary histories to unfold in ways that cannot simply be recreated after a habitat is removed. Seabed extraction would therefore be different from harvesting a mobile population. Removing mineral deposits from an active vent field can disturb the physical foundation on which entire communities depend. Sediment plumes may spread beyond the immediate excavation area, while machinery can alter surfaces that took geological processes immense periods of time to construct. For animals with extremely restricted ranges, there may be nowhere else to move. The timing matters because science is still catching up with the place itself. The discovery of Loki archaeota transformed the study of complex life by revealing a previously unknown branch of archaea carrying genetic features associated with the cellular complexity of eukaryotes. Related organisms have since expanded that picture. The sediment beneath an Arctic vent is therefore not merely habitat, it can preserve clues about the deep history of life. Human presence also differs from every other force moving through this ocean because it contains intention. A shark follows temperature, an orca follows prey, a walrus follows food across the seabed. Currents follow pressure, density, and the shape of the earth. Human beings can choose whether a route is opened, whether a deposit is extracted, whether research continues, and whether a rare biological community is given time to be understood. That distinction places responsibility in an unusual position. The Arctic is changing through physical processes that no single species controls, but the speed and direction of human influence can still alter the conditions surrounding those processes. Beneath the changing ice, the oldest inhabitants of the ocean continue their lives according to chemistry, temperature, instinct, and evolution. The newest predator carries something none of them possess: the ability to decide what happens next. That choice can become part of the ecosystem's history long after the machinery has gone. Across the Arctic, survival is narrowing along several boundaries at once. A ringed seal needs stable winter ice, not simply as a place to rest, but as the roof beneath which its birth lair can remain concealed from the surrounding sea. When the ice forms late, breaks early, or becomes fractured by changing conditions, that shelter becomes less dependable, and pups face a different beginning before they have learned to swim. For narwhals, the margin is drawn through the passages between pack ice and deeper water. Their seasonal movements depend on routes that remain usable beneath and between frozen surfaces. When those corridors change unexpectedly, entrapment can follow, leaving groups with limited access to breathing openings and migration routes. Their world is shaped by the geometry of ice, water, and distance, and a small change in that geometry can alter an entire journey. Farther down the food web, Arctic cod occupies cold water associated with the underside of sea ice. The retreat of that habitat does more than move a fish northward. It concentrates an important source of energy into a smaller region, narrowing the feeding space available to seals, belugas, narwhals, and other predators that depend on the fish directly or indirectly. A contraction at the foundation, therefore, travels upward without needing to cross any single boundary. The bowhead whale carries another adaptation written into the thickness of winter. It can break through ice from below to create breathing holes, but dense pack ice also provides protection from orcas. Historically, ice thick enough to shape access could separate predator and prey. As suitable pack ice becomes thinner and more fragmented, that separation becomes less reliable. The same physical change that alters breathing habitat can also alter the distance between a whale and its hunter. Even the Greenland shark has a thermal boundary. Its physiology is closely associated with very cold water, and as warmer Atlantic water advances through the Barents Sea, the coldest conditions become increasingly concentrated toward the north and at greater depth. The shark can move, but movement is not the same as preserving the world in which a species evolved. A habitat can remain present on a map while becoming progressively smaller in temperature, location, and season. Belugas face overlapping limits. Ice can provide shelter from orca attacks, while Arctic cod provides an important part of the food available within their range. As both refuge and prey shift, two essential pieces of the same animal's environment can contract together. The result is not a single obstacle appearing in isolation, but several boundaries moving in the same direction. That pattern is what makes the transformation unusually broad. The ringed seal, narwhal, Arctic cod, bowhead, Greenland shark, and beluga do not share identical needs, yet their needs intersect through the physical presence of ice. The frozen surface determines shelter, feeding grounds, migration corridors, predator access, and temperature. When that structure changes, each species loses part of its margin at the same time as the others. An ecological margin is the space between conditions that are merely possible and conditions that remain reliably usable. For these animals, that space is narrowing together. Their adaptations were shaped within a particular arrangement of cold water, seasonal darkness, drifting ice, prey movement, and protected passages. Remove enough of the structure, and the adaptations themselves remain, but the circumstances that made them effective begin to disappear. The Arctic world is therefore being compressed from many directions at once. What recedes is not only frozen water, but the physical framework that once connected breeding, feeding, migration, refuge, and predation into a stable system. The ice did not simply occupy this ecosystem, it helped define its boundaries, and those boundaries are now moving. A breathing hole in winter ice can look like a simple opening, a dark circle surrounded by frozen water. For a ringed seal, it is the visible end of an inheritance written through countless generations. The seal's claws, whiskers, camouflage, and snow-covered birth lair belong to a connected history of survival. Each feature carries evidence of pressures that existed long before any individual seal entered the sea. The lair itself is more than shelter. Built beneath a bank of snow formed over stable ice, it conceals a mother and pup from predators while providing a protected space during the most vulnerable period of the animal's life. The pup's pale coat continues the same logic above the surface, blending with the winter landscape. Multiple breathing holes extend that strategy into the surrounding water, allowing movement without abandoning access to air. None of these traits appeared because they were useful in some abstract sense. They were refined because particular conditions repeatedly rewarded animals that possessed them. The same principle reaches a different level in the orca. Carousel feeding is not encoded as a fixed sequence inside a chromosome. It is learned behavior, carried through observation and repetition within a social group. Young whales watch experienced adults coordinate movement around prey, timing their actions with the shape of the fjord and the position of the ice. A calf inherits more than genes from its mother. It inherits information accumulated by the community. That distinction gives culture a strange place in evolution. Genetic inheritance can preserve a useful structure across generations, but learned behavior depends upon individuals remaining alive long enough to teach it. If a population carrying a specialized hunting tradition disappears, the knowledge can vanish with the last experienced animals. There is no fossil layer preserving the instructions. There may be no sequence in the genome capable of reconstructing the missing technique. The archive exists in memory, passed from one living mind to another across generations of experience. The Greenland shark carries another kind of record. Its extraordinary longevity is intertwined with an environment where metabolism, movement, and food availability operate at unusually slow rates. A life extending across centuries allows an animal to survive long intervals between successful feeding opportunities. Growth remains extremely slow, and sexual maturity arrives only after many decades. Longevity is therefore not an accidental feature attached to the species. It is part of the strategy that allowed the species to persist within its particular ecological conditions. Far below the surface, the organisms surrounding Loki's castle preserve an older chapter still. Their chemosynthetic way of life depends on chemical energy rather than sunlight, allowing biological communities to flourish where photosynthesis cannot reach. Such metabolism belongs to a lineage of strategies that reaches deep into Earth's history, before the appearance of animals and before the modern oxygen-rich atmosphere transformed the planet. These living systems are archives without pages. A seal's lair records an ancient relationship with ice and predators. An orca's learned technique records knowledge held by a family and its wider community. A Greenland shark's lifespan records an adaptation to scarcity and cold. Vent organisms record the persistence of life powered by chemistry from Earth's interior. When one of these species disappears, the loss is larger than the absence of a body. An evolutionary solution disappears with it, along with the circumstances that shaped that solution and the information accumulated through its use. The ocean, therefore, contains not only living creatures, but countless experiments preserved in motion, each carrying an answer that took immense time to develop and cannot simply be written again once the archive is gone. There are lives long enough to contain centuries, without ever leaving the same sea. The Greenland shark belongs to that rare scale of existence, where history is not something remembered by records or monuments, but something physically passed through. One of the oldest sharks studied was estimated to have lived for about 392 years, with the broader estimate extending toward 512. If born in the early 1600s, an animal of that age could have entered the Arctic during a period when European hunters were only beginning to establish regular contact with Svalbard. Generations of people would come and disappear while the same animal continued moving through the surrounding water. The world above its back would have changed repeatedly. Walruses once gathered across the archipelago in numbers reaching the tens of thousands. Bowhead whales were once far more numerous than the remnant populations found today. Hunting transformed both species, reducing animals that had occupied these waters for generations. Laws eventually changed, protection followed, and populations began to recover. Through all of those human chapters, a Greenland shark could have remained below the surface, following prey through conditions that seemed ordinary only because they were the conditions of its life. The Little Ice Age brought centuries of generally colder conditions across the North Atlantic and Arctic regions. Later came a different direction, with warming waters, retreating sea ice, and increasing influence from Atlantic water. A shark living for several centuries could therefore encounter more than one climatic regime within a single lifetime. Its body does not preserve dates, but its continued existence places it inside a span of environmental history that no short-lived vertebrate can experience directly. Time moves differently for an animal whose growth is measured across decades. The shark does not hurry toward adulthood, and it does not need to cross the ocean rapidly to complete a seasonal journey. Its movements can be slow, sometimes less than 1 mile per hour, allowing its surroundings to change around it, while the animal itself remains remarkably persistent. At those speeds, a lifetime becomes less like a journey toward a destination and more like an extended passage through changing water. There is something unusual about placing such an animal inside a rapidly changing ecosystem. A creature that has already endured centuries of natural variation might seem perfectly suited to change. Yet, longevity does not automatically provide adaptability. Evolution operates through generations, and a species whose individuals mature only after roughly 150 years experiences remarkably few generations within the span of a human century. The oldest shark in these waters may therefore carry an extraordinary temporal perspective without possessing any way to understand it. It does not compare one decade with another. It does not remember the shape of an earlier ice edge. It simply inhabits the conditions available at each moment, responding to temperature, prey, depth, and currents as they arrive. Around it, however, the physical setting is being altered within a fraction of the time its life has already endured. Warmer Atlantic water reaches farther north. Sea ice occupies less space for less of the year. Prey distributions shift. The shark can move toward conditions that remain suitable, but each movement occurs within an ocean whose boundaries are being redrawn. For hundreds of years, Persistence was enough to carry this animal through changing Arctic worlds. Now its great age becomes part of the story itself. The Greenland shark has seen more seasons than any human generation can imagine, yet the present ocean is changing on a timescale measured not by centuries, but by decades. Its body remains adapted to the cold world that shaped it, while the water around that ancient body begins to belong to a different Arctic. At the floor of the Fram Strait, beneath thousands of feet of sea water, another version of this ocean continues on its own terms. The bacterial mats around Loki's castle draw energy from chemicals rising through the seafloor, where heat and mineral-rich fluids emerge from the Earth's interior. Their existence does not depend on sunlight reaching the surface or on the seasonal rhythm of Arctic ice. That separation gives these communities an unusual relationship with time. The surface ecosystem can be reorganized by a few decades of warming, yet the organisms around the vents are connected to geological processes that operate across far longer intervals. Their habitat is shaped by fractures in the oceanic crust, circulation through rock, and chemical reactions that turn inorganic compounds into usable energy. Life here is powered by geology itself. Among the sediment dwellers are members of the group known as Loki archaeota, discovered through genetic evidence from sediments near Loki's castle. Their significance reaches beyond the Arctic. They belong to an archaeal lineage closely related to the organisms thought to have contributed to the origin of complex cells. In that sense, the sediment contains traces of a biological history extending far beyond the animals living above it. The lineage behind these organisms predates the great animal radiations of the oceans. It existed before whales, before seals, before sharks occupied their modern forms. Its descendants persisted through the Permian-Triassic extinction roughly 252 million years ago, when most marine species disappeared. They endured the environmental upheavals associated with the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, and they remained through repeated glacial cycles that transformed the Arctic surface again and again. None of this means that the organisms are invulnerable. Vent communities depend on precise chemical conditions, and individual fields can change as geological activity shifts. Their apparent stability comes from living within a system governed by different forces. A warming atmosphere cannot directly remove their energy source. Retreating sea ice cannot expose their habitat. A migrating orca cannot alter the chemistry of a mineral-rich vent chimney. Far above, the surface animals occupy a much more connected world. Their food, shelter, migration routes, breeding grounds, and predator relationships are tied together through temperature, ice, currents, and seasonal productivity. A change in one part can travel through many others. At the vents, the chain begins differently. Chemical energy enters through the seafloor. Microorganisms transform it, and other organisms build their lives around that foundation. This creates a strange contrast within a single ocean. Near the surface, centuries of ecological history are being rearranged within the span of human generations. Deep below, organisms descended from some of Earth's oldest successful cellular strategies continue to inhabit conditions that remain fundamentally recognizable to them. The distinction is not simply between shallow and deep water. It is between two different kinds of dependence. The surface world depends heavily on a climate system connected to the atmosphere and the seasonal presence of ice. The vent world depends on the chemistry of the planet beneath the ocean. One is exposed to changes moving through air, water, and sunlight. The other is anchored to processes occurring within the crust. And so, far below the changing hunting grounds, the seafloor keeps its own record. Its organisms do not remember the centuries above them, nor do they need to. Their survival is written into a different set of conditions, maintained by heat, minerals, pressure, and chemistry. While the upper ocean changes around its animals, the deep communities continue drawing energy from the earth itself, carrying an ancient form of life through a present that barely touches them. The water remains, immense and cold beneath the winter surface, carrying the same currents through which every life in this story has been connected. Near the ice, seawater can approach -2 degrees Celsius, about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, while farther below, pressure and darkness reshape the conditions without erasing the relationships above. The ocean keeps moving, even when its surface appears fixed. Somewhere across the Barents Sea, an orca travels with its pod. Its body follows a pattern learned through experience, memory, and repetition. A sound travels outward, returns from another animal, and becomes information. The pod adjusts together. What one generation discovered can become part of the behavioral inheritance passed from mother to calf, allowing knowledge to remain alive even though it is never written into genes. Elsewhere, a Greenland shark moves through cold water at less than 1 kilometer per hour, about less than 1 mile per hour. Its pace belongs to an entirely different rhythm. An animal capable of living for centuries does not need to hurry through every moment. It moves through a world where encounters with food may be separated by long intervals, carrying an evolutionary history far older than any human memory. Near the surface, a ringed seal rises toward one of its breathing holes. During winter, a network of openings gives the animal access to air beneath the ice, and the location of those openings can determine where it travels and rests. Each emergence is part of an inherited pattern shaped by a habitat that once remained dependable across generations. The seal cannot choose the temperature of the water, the thickness of the ice, or the timing of its retreat. Far below, a narwhal can descend beyond 1,500 meters, about 4,900 feet, entering water where sunlight has disappeared completely. Sound becomes its primary sense for building a picture of the surroundings. Echoes reveal the seafloor, nearby animals, and the movement of prey. Above that depth, an orca may be listening through the same water, connecting two hunters through sound even when neither can see the other. Still deeper, near the Arctic mid-ocean ridge, the vents of Loki's castle release superheated water into the surrounding ocean. Temperatures inside the vent fluids can approach 371 degrees Celsius, about 700 degrees Fahrenheit, yet the organisms living around the chimneys occupy the cooler boundaries where chemistry supports life. Their existence follows another energy pathway, separated from the surface food web by thousands of meters of water and a completely different source of power. Above all of these worlds, the ice continues to respond to the climate around it. Its retreat changes the geography of hunting, shelter, migration, and feeding without making a sound that any animal could recognize as a signal of transformation. A thinner sheet changes where a seal can rest. An opening corridor changes where a whale can travel. A newly accessible passage changes where an orca can search. Nothing beneath the surface makes a decision about those changes. The animals respond according to bodies shaped by evolution and behaviors shaped by experience. The vent organisms continue according to chemistry. The ice itself follows the balance between heat entering and leaving the Arctic system. The choices belong elsewhere, in the world above the ocean. They determine how rapidly the surface conditions change, how much habitat remains, and which pressures become permanent features of the water. Beneath Svalbard, The animals continue living inside the conditions available to them, each carrying an ancient solution into a changing sea. The water remains, the hunters remain, the old life beneath the vents remains, and beneath the shifting boundary between ocean and atmosphere, the Arctic continues its long movement. One current, one migration, one breath, and one generation at a time.